Chapter 1. Newly transmigrated God. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Shi Wei had transmigrated to another world. Contrary to the popular trend of unlucky fellow transmigrators who became creatures such as goblins and gale wolves, he had become a god. But Shi Wei did not think that he was all that lucky. In fact, if he had the choice, he would rather switch places with those other transmigrators. Why, you'd ask? Because regardless of whether their souls or bodies were reincarnated, at least they had a physical body. He, however, became a ball of light. Not only that, the divinity that he had been imbued with as the god of games was already borderline unstable, to the point where after a while he might not even be able to maintain his form as a ball of light. Utilizing the little divine energy he had left, he quickly checked through his divine records, his findings making him not know whether to laugh or to cry. In this fantasy world he was thrown into, there were lots of different deities, most of which were ancient, having existed for long periods of time, with him, the god of games, being relatively new and inexperienced as a god. In fact, his particular divinity was born in a very unorthodox way, from a past kingdom called Tierra in the mortal realm, the prime material plane. The 11th monarch of this kingdom, Yakuran XI, was said to be an immoral, self-indulgent ruler, spending all his days addicted to games, be it card games, chess, or games like polo and soccer, without attending to internal affairs. He had always been an atheist, not believing in or liking any religion. However, in this world filled with different deities, being an atheist in itself was an act of heresy. Even he, as a monarch, would be ill spoken of and called into question. This trait would be used as an excuse for those who coveted the throne and wanted to condemn him and renounce his claim to the throne. Stuck with the dilemma of wanting to prevent anything of the sort from happening but not wanting to bow his proud head to any religion, he thought of a perfect plan. He announced that he was a believer in the god of games, and launched a multifaceted plan to make his people join the religion he created, giving promises and benefits to the aristocrats and by enforcing the law, somehow managing to pull together the Church of the God of Games. Soon after its creation, the religion rooted itself in Tierra, growing stronger in members as the days went by, to the point where more than half of the population of the kingdom became devout believers of the religion. As the number of believers increased, the combined devotion created a god which had never existed in the pantheon before, the god of games. However, games are addictive. And as the religion grew, more and more people became addicted to games, especially gambling, and did not do their roles in society, causing the originally strong Tierra to fall from glory. Yakuran couldn't even pass the throne to his son before the country was split and taken over by several small countries surrounding the borders of the kingdom. Having seen the entirety of the rise and fall of Tierra, the surrounding kingdoms all severely rejected and banned the Church of the God of Games, restricting all their citizens from joining the religion. The strong and thriving church fell and disbanded in the blink of an eye, most of its believers deserting the religion. Being a newly created deity, the original god of games did not even get a chance to stabilize its divinity before the entire thing went south, causing its less than clear consciousness to dissipate, making way for a soul from Earth to take over its place. And now I have to deal with this mess. Shi Wei sighed, feeling a headache coming, even though he did not even have a head in this state. My divinity isn't stable yet, and my divine energy is sparse and weak. This can't get any worse, can it? That being said, Shi Wei did not rush to do anything, but instead tried his best to make heads or tails of the whole situation. First, he created a way to measure the amount of divine energy left, chalking it up to 10 points. As for why he did not set it as just 1 point, it was because he found that the divine energy he had left actually wasn't all that shabby. If he were to convert it all to raw energy and throw it at the mortal plane, it would probably be able to immediately disintegrate an army of 10,000, more or less the power of an atomic bomb. But if he wanted to stabilize his divinity, he would have to rack up at least 100 units of divine energy first. Now he only had a few devout gamblers still believing in him, but the rate at which they generated divine energy was so underwhelming that he'd even believe it if they all converted to the Church of the Goddess of Fortune, Lady Fortuna, at the tip of a hat. I can't let it go on like this. Shi Wei carefully checked the abilities he currently had. Deities often had a variety of different abilities, but at the very core, each deity was composed of 3 basic traits: divine grace, divine fury, and divine order. To put it simply, divine grace was when a deity communicates with their believers in the mortal realm, leaving behind prophecies and sacred items, or imbuing their believers with strength and power. Priests and clergy for the church could also call upon the deity's power to perform spells and divine feats. Divine fury was a deity's power and rage, a threshold that mortals could not encroach, or even think of tainting. Divine punishment was an extension of this trait. Divine order was the basis of a deity's divinity, a power so great that it was on the same level as the laws of nature itself. For example, a god of harvest could ignore the seasons and allow crops to sprout and grow, and to control harvests and even control the weather to a certain extent. As long as it is part of their sphere of influence, deities could single-handedly affect the natural laws of the world. That being said, many deities had overlapping spheres of influence. As an example, 3 high-ranked deities: God of the Sun Emporio, God of Light Lianti, and Daychaser Yukov, and a whole bunch of lower-tier deities have influence over the concept of light. As the god of games, Shi Wei's divine order was very ambiguous, as he had influence over everything that had to do with games, even the concept of luck and fortune. While that looks and sounds pretty amazing, if he were to compare the influence he had over these concepts, he would probably do even worse than a third-grade deity. To put it in another way, Shi Wei could extend his influence to a certain extent as a god of beasts to control wild animals and even magical beings, as animal hunting and beast fighting are considered games. However, if an actual deity of beasts had 90% influence over beasts, Shi Wei's influence might not even be 1%. The jack of all trades, but master of none. No wonder his believers deserted his religion so easily. If they wanted specific blessings and gifts from him, they could just as easily gotten the same blessings from other gods, and maybe even stronger blessings than the ones he could have given. You're a gambler and you want a lucky streak. You can worship Lady Fortuna. You're a gladiator and you want a stronger body. You can worship the god of war. You're a rider and you want to develop a stronger relationship with your mount. You can worship Beifeng. So why would you need a bicycle? 1. Maybe it's not as worthless as I thought. If it were a local deity facing the same mess he was, they'd probably only be able to close their eyes and wait for their inevitable dissipation. But Shi Wei was different. As your standard stay.at-home otaku from Earth, the concept of games to him wasn't as simple as cards, mahjong, and Colosseum fighting one that they were used to in this world. Games are a crystallization of the efforts and innovation of generations of people, popularized by the internet and built from ground up, known as the 9th form of art. And as a pioneer of Earth into this unfamiliar new world, Shi Wei decided to first build a system. Chapter 2. Arrival. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Having read a lot of Isekai web novels one before he had transmigrated, Shi Wei found that those that had supernatural abilities all had clear stages and ranks, for example, Bronze, Silver, and Gold or Sword Scholar, Sword Emperor, and Sword Sage. But coming to this world, he realized that the same could not be said for this world. Of course, it was a given that there would be a difference in prowess between different people. But in a world filled with deities, martial prowess could not completely correspond to reputation and social standing. In the brilliant white church which worshipped one of the 7 heavenly fathers, God of Light Lianti, there was a seemingly complete ranking system for paladins going from revered knight, honorable knight, glorious knight, divine knight. However, a vast majority of people ranked as honorable knights were aristocrats who had bought their way up to that position by buying divine grace tickets. The same could be said for glorious knights too, many of them had achieved that rank without being qualified for it. Speaking purely in terms of ability, these people could not even hold a candle to a soldier who had earned their title as a praised knight through military merit. The only ones which still held some degree of authority were the divine knights, as that rank could only be appointed by a deity. So in words, the polarization between the rich and the poor was pretty deeply rooted in the society of this world, as however devout a peasant could be, most of their time would ultimately be consumed by the toil of everyday life, to the point where a year's worth of prayer might not even amount to an aristocrat's daily offering of illuminating crystals. Even in this world full of deities, there would only be a few lucky ones who could grab the attention of a deity at birth and become chosen ones or saints, or saintesses, that would be sought after and revered. No matter how hard-working a person was, they would have no chance of climbing up the social ladder without the attention of a deity. This was reality after all, and deities were not powerful and all-knowing. It was understood that this sort of situation would happen in a society completely controlled by humans. However, this granted Shi Wei an opportunity to take advantage of the situation. The commoners who were exploited and looked down upon by the churches would be the ones that would become the basis for his church to grow exponentially. Perhaps it was because he was a transmigrator that Shi Wei realized that aside from the abilities the original god of games had, he discovered that he could freely traverse the barriers between the different realms. Even though it was somewhat restricting, he had a pretty large advantage when compared to other deities. Normally, a deity would be bound by the natural laws of the world, and could only descend to the mortal realm in 3 ways. The first way would be through an oracle, where the deity would attach wisps of their consciousness to an item blessed by them or on an idol created in their image, or by directly entering the dreams of a devout believer one. Most prophecies and divine proclamations were passed to the mortal realm through this method. The second way would be through possession, where the deity would possess one of their chosen ones as their temporary vessel. The amount of power a deity would be able to utilize in this state would depend directly on the capacity of the vessel, and how much they would be able to withstand. That being said, the capacity of a chosen one favored by a deity would not be low in the first place. The final way would be through astral projection, where the deity would temporarily project an astral shadow of themselves to the mortal realm, damaging their divinity in the process. This would be the strongest form a deity would be able to take without violating the natural laws, holding around 80% of their original power. Even a random third-grade deity's astral shadow would be able to rival a legendary warrior, let alone deities of even higher power. Putting aside the first way which did not have much battle prowess, possession could last for quite a long time. That being said, one possession would practically render a chosen one useless. To put it into perspective, even in the churches of the 7 Heavenly Fathers, which were some of the strongest churches around, the number of chosen ones would not amount to more than 30. Astral projection was not only short-lasting, but it also damages the divinity of the deity who does it. To deities, their divinity was equivalent to the significance of the soul to human beings. It was of the utmost importance to a deity. Therefore, a deity would not choose to descend using this method except for as a last resort. As for directly descending to the mortal realm, it would probably be impossible to accomplish. The natural laws set by the Trinity of creation were extremely hard to override, so much so that even the 7 Heavenly Fathers would have to pay a hefty price to get through the barriers between realms. In the best situation, their divinity would be extremely damaged, while in the worst-case scenario, they would immediately cease to exist. And despite all that, Shi Wei could bypass all of these restrictions as a transmigrator, depleting divine energy as compensation to descend his mortal self from his past life into the mortal realm. He could even call upon the power he saved in the divine realm whenever he needed it. It was simply illegal, granted the amount of energy he had in the divine realm now was pitifully low. I only have 7 days worth of divine energy left. Alright. Let's do this. Kennington was a small mountain village far away from the city. Remote and poor, the villagers kept to themselves and rarely strayed or moved away from the village, and no one entered the remote village as well, except for when intermarriage happened between them and the surrounding villages. There have been some youngsters who had traveled to big cities with big dreams and stars in their eyes. However, in this xenophobic society, these youngsters who had no special skills other than hunting had to return miserably to the village, continuing to live in danger and poverty. That was the case, until a special guest arrived in the village 3 days ago. 12-year-old Alina trod through large expanses of barren potato fields, her steps light and sprightly as her silver twin-tails swayed in tandem with her movements. Arriving at a small stone cottage out of the village, she knocked gently on the door. After a while, the faulty wooden door creaked open. Appearing at the door was a thin and lanky young man. He did not seem to be in good health, his cheeks pale and lacking color, making him look weak and sickly. "Hello, Mr. Shiwei," the girl greeted, bowing her head politely. "Ah, if it isn't Alina. How is your uncle?" The young man was naturally Shiwei, who had just descended to the mortal realm. However, since the divine energy he had left was sparse, he couldn't waste too much on creating an avatar for himself. Finally, he decided to use 1 point of divine energy to create a low-budget avatar of himself, using what he looked like in his past life as a blueprint. He came to this village as a priest, and temporarily lived in this stone cottage through the village elders' arrangements. The day before, Alina's uncle had been grievously wounded when he went out hunting. Shiwei was the one who stood out to heal him, bringing him back from the brink of death. "He's almost completely healed. Grandpa Elder said that your sacred healing arts are even stronger than the clerics from the brilliant white church." She chirped happily. "That goes without saying. I'm a deity after all," he thought. "This is the tiger meat that my uncle hunted for earlier. He especially had me bring it to you. It's already cooked," she said, handing the basket in her hands to Shiwei, gulping quietly. "My aunt's technique is superb, please try it." Shiwei accepted the unseemingly hefty basket. It seemed that there was quite a lot of roasted meat inside. Looking over at Alina, who could hardly hide her hunger, he could not help but smile, but his smile gave people a feeling that he had kidney deficiency 1. "I can't finish all this by myself, why don't you help me finish this?" "Really?" she asked in surprise, eyes sparkling like a hungry cat. However, the next moment she lowers her head and fidgets a little, remembering how her family had warned against doing so. "Wouldn't I be bothering you?" she asked tentatively. "Oh, then I have to finish this by myself then." Shiwei sighed, shaking his head. Alina let out a downcast whine, lowering her head and pouting cutely. Now, turn that frown upside down and come in. Let's eat." Thank you Mr. Shiwei." Chapter 3. Alina, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation, I only have tea, is that okay? Shiwei had only been occupying this cottage for 3 days after all, so he had a lot of household items missing. In spite of that, there was no chance he would waste divine energy to create those things. Objectively speaking, these 3 days were the poorest and simplest Shiwei had lived in both his lifetimes. He missed his phone, computer, and takeout dearly. "It's alright, I'm fine with it even if you only have plain water." Alina chirped, her silver twin-tails swaying rhythmically as she rocked excitedly in her chair. Pouring her a cup of tea, Shiwei took out a dinner plate, deftly cutting up the roasted meat into smaller pieces and arranging them neatly on the plate before serving it, placing it carefully on the old wooden table. Eyes sparkling, the young girl immediately reached for a piece of meat, and was about to eat it before she noticed Shiwei's gaze on her, so she held in her excitement and started nibbling on it daintily like a well-mannered little lady. "Don't mind me, please eat all you want," he couldn't help saying, smiling wryly. "That won't do. My father said that I must always be polite and well-mannered," Alina said earnestly. "Oh." Shiwei raised his brow curiously. If he remembered correctly, Alina was an orphan who was currently living with her uncle. "Ah. What do you mean by that expression, Mr. Shiwei? Don't you believe in me?" The little one exclaimed in dissatisfaction, the threat coming out weak due to the sauce stain at the edge of her mouth. No, I was just a little surprised that someone from such a remote village like this cared about manners, he explained. Actually, the way he said this held some prejudice against Kennington Village, and if it were anyone else from the village here today, Shi Wei would not have said anything of the sort. However, through the past few days of interacting with Elena, he knew that the girl was not someone who would go around running their mouth, nor was she someone who assumed the worst of someone. True to his assumptions, Elena did not even realize the slightly demeaning context in Shi Wei's words, only pouting softly and grumbling. My father had said that my mother was a noble woman from the city, and that one day I might have a chance to meet my maternal relatives one day. That's why I have to always be well-mannered, even though I think it's very troublesome. Hearing her words, Shi Wei could almost visualize the makings of a grand 10. Season 120. Episode soap opera about love and fantasy in his mind. However, as a deity, he did not have too much interest in the family matters of a mortal, so he quickly changed the topic. Elena, what deities do the people from your village worship? He asked carefully. My father worships the god of the hunt and the goddess of the forest, while Grandpa Elder and my aunt believe in the god of harvest and the lord of the mountains, while my father hopes that I can worship the god of light just like my mother did, she recounted, stretching her fingers with each person she talked about. Did worshipping the god of harvest do any good? Did the harvests in the village become more abundant? Shi Wei continued on asking. Maybe just a little. Elena replied absently, but judging from her expression she didn't believe in what she said either. I don't worship the god of harvest, nor am I a part of the natural sect one. If you have anything to say you can just tell me, HM. Shi Wei said encouragingly, his tone gentle. It actually wasn't of any use, the harvests were even lacking last year. Grandpa Elder was almost extorted to death by the tax officer. Elena complained indignantly. Shi Wei nodded internally, this was all to be expected. A great majority of commoners would worship 2 or more deities at once, dividing the little time they had left to pray and worship to different deities and causing many of them to only be shallow believers. After all, one of the prerequisites for wanting to become a true believer of a deity was to completely devote oneself to a deity, or 2 deities who had close relations with one another. This type of scattered worshipping from commoners made it so that the blessings they got from that deity would be extremely ineffective, so much so that there would not be any real difference to traditional farmers back on Earth who were at mercy of weather and natural disasters. Realistically, even if a commoner devoted all their time and devotion to worship a deity, their prayer would still be too insignificant to attract the attention of a deity. Normally no one would worship more than 3 deities at a time, unless they were of the same sect, or of the same deific origin. If they did, they would have been seen as excessive believers, on the same level as atheists. There were 2 reasons why commoners still worshipped deities even though their lives were still miserable. Firstly, they wanted to find spiritual support, and secondly it was because commoners were exploited by churches, with the churches having almost monopolized medical treatment, knowledge, and most of the manufacturing industry. If commoners wanted to receive medical attention, they would have to worship a deity. If they encountered bandits or beasts and wanted the help of the crusaders, they would need to worship a deity. Even when they need to buy certain goods, they would have to worship specific deities. Under the influence of how society worked like this, even if worshipping a deity did not help with their lives or even making it harder for them, commoners would still choose some deities to worship. Mr. Shi Wei, which deities do you worship? The great gospel of life. Or is it the great god of light? Elena asked curiously, tilting her head. Your sacred healing arts are so powerful, the deity you're worshipping must be extremely powerful too. Finally asking about the subject he was trying to bring up, Shi Wei gathered his spirits and nodded. I believe in an extremely rare and honorable deity. Which one? According to plan, Elena asked curiously, her attention attracted by the prospect of an unknown deity. Have you ever heard of the god of games? The god of games. Elena shook her head in puzzlement. I have never heard of him. He is a great deity with countless spheres of influence. Unfortunately, this also became his downfall. He was so omnipotent that the other deities were jealous of him and banned him from expanding his influence, making it so that he had no fame in the mortal realm. Shi Wei said solemnly, I am the priest of the great and devilishly handsome god of games, looking for someone who can become a saintess under his name. Elena, are you willing to become the saintess of the god of games? Although these words sounded like a strange perverted man trying to kidnap a young girl, Shi Wei swore that he was not a pedophile. He asked her purely out of the merit that she was the one he had come into contact the most in this time he stayed in this village. At the same time, he thought that Elena was a pure, adorable and gifted young lady who fits the bill of the saintess he had in mind perfectly. Saintess. Elena's mouth hung agape as her eyes widened comically. Yes, a saintess. If you join our church, you can immediately become our saintess. Shi Wei continued, trying to persuade the young girl to join. Elena considered for a while before eventually shaking her head. I'm sorry, Mr. Shi Wei. Thank you for your goodwill, but I think I'm still going to worship the god of light like my father wanted me to, she said apologetically. Is that so? Shi Wei sighed heavily and hung his head, having failed to convince her. That being said, he did not continue to force the young girl to listen to him, since true belief could not be forced. A failure, as expected, just 3 days of interaction wasn't enough to get me a saintess, he thought dejectedly. Fortunately it wasn't completely a bust, as the remaining divine energy he had left could probably last him another 4 days. Now he had to decide whether he should continue staying in Kennington, or to leave for another village to try his luck. Even if he could not get his church a saintess, developing a couple of believers would be good too. Elena looked at the roasted meat still on her fork longingly, then looked back at Shi Wei. Can I still eat? She asked carefully. Eat, he sighed in exasperation at how the girl was acting. I'm not that stingy. Chapter 4. Dragonfang. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Elena, did you go visit that priest again? The village elder who had been standing at the entrance of the village asked, seeing Elena running back to the village. Yes, I did, elder. Elena answered happily. You better keep your distance from him, young lady, the village elder advised sternly, he's too suspicious. But Mr. Shi Wei just healed Uncle Pierre yesterday. Elena asked in confusion. Yes, and he didn't even ask for 1 copper coin in compensation. If it were a priest from the city, the amount required for them to heal an injury of that degree would be at least 300 ryans. The village elder explained patiently, nodding in response to her question. This is why I don't believe that he is a good person, child. Listen to me and don't go seeing him anymore, alright child. The village chief, who was over 60 years old, could already be regarded as pretty long-lived in this world. His long years had made him more knowledgeable and experienced than the average villager. If Shi Wei had asked for anything in return such as money or some young ladies from the village, he would not have been so worried, but this sort of person who seemingly wanted nothing in return was the most dangerous in his opinion. In the past there had been such a person that had appeared in one of the nearby villages. He seemed amiable and approachable, helping the villagers to fix their buildings and do their farm work. It wasn't a long time before he was accepted by the innocent villagers. In a twist of events, that man turned out to be a fanatic cult member of an evil god. While he was gaining the trust of the villagers, he used nearly a year's worth of time to convert the village into a sacrificial platform, killing all the villagers and sacrificing their flesh and blood overnight. When the militia had arrived, the originally lively and thriving village was reduced to a grotesque scene of corpses consumed by the subordinates of the evil god. The village elder was one of the members of the militia back in the day, and he could never shake the hellish image from his head in his entire life. Mr. Shi Wei isn't as bad as you say he is. Elena refuted, pouting indignantly. The village elder was going to say something, before a sturdily built young man rushed over in a panic. Village elder, I have bad news. The young man shouted, panting as he tried to catch his breath. Our hunting team found a pile of fresh dragon fang dung in a forest not far away from our village. Pierre said that the slaw, he cut himself off, noticing the young girl standing nearby. Changing his words quickly, he continued, the incident that happened at Hawk's village might have been done by this dragon fang, and now it migrated to this area. It might set its sights on us. Not knowing what a dragon fang was, Elena tilted her head curiously, listening into the conversation. What? The village elder exclaimed, the wrinkles on his forehead growing deeper with worry. A dragon fang was an extremely fierce and bloodthirsty creature that was somewhere between a wild animal and a magical beast. Its size was twice that of tigers and lions, with monstrous strength that could kill a boar with one blow. Growing on its tail were large, sharp bony spikes shaped like a dragon's teeth. Even a team of hunters wouldn't be able to put a scratch on it. Even more worrying was the fact that these cunning and cruel monsters absolutely adored the taste of humans, especially their brains. That was the reason why they often snuck into villages to prey on the young and the weak, using the bony spikes on their tails to crack open their skulls and feast on their brains while they were still fresh, all while leaving farm animals alive. Have the hunting team stop going out to hunt for the next few days. Tonight I'll have everyone gather up some money that you're a fast runner. First thing tomorrow morning, bring the money with you to Yugen City and have the Crusaders from the Holy Corps send help. The village elder commanded, before he continued, remember, you can only ask help from the brilliant white church or the Temple of Glory. The young man nodded in understanding, and was about to reply before alarming chimes resounded from the western lookout tower, causing both the village elder and the young man's faces to pale dramatically. The village, which had been rather quiet up to that point, suddenly burst into action in response, with many capable villagers coming out to protect their homes with crudely made weapons. They hadn't even done anything before the chiming abruptly stopped, and was replaced by a harrowing wail. Soon after, the wooden lookout tower collapsed, and from the ashes came a monster that looked like a grotesquely large wolf, with bony scales covering its body. It sauntered into the fray slowly with a bloody arm hanging from its maw, terrifying tail sweeping and creating clouds of dust as it shuffled closer to the village. Even though it stood on 4 legs, its eyes were already on eye level with an average human, showing exactly how large it was. This monster was stronger and more powerful than its kin. Run, Elena. The village elder pushed the girl behind him and resolutely stood in front of her protectively along with the young man. At this point in time, there were villagers who had already tried to attack the dragon fang, but the monster had enough power to snap a human into 2 along with their weapons in one bite, and could crush a human's head like a watermelon with a swing of its tail, not to mention those claws that could easily leave marks on the sturdiest granite. Not only that, the dragon fang was extremely fast and agile that even the arrows that the hunters were proud of could hit it. Even if a stray arrow hit, it would be deflected by the bone plates on the monster's back, unable to cause any effective damage. The villagers had no chance. Elena was so terrified that her knees buckled and she could barely stay standing. She knew that her presence wouldn't have been of any help, but she couldn't flee for life as the people she regarded as family were getting massacred in cold blood. After blanking out from fear for a moment, she suddenly remembered someone who could help. Mr. Shiwei. Yes, if it's him. Even though she didn't know what type of deity the god of games was, but she knew that if Shiwei could appoint a saintess, he would definitely be someone strong. If it were him, maybe he could find a way to defeat this terrible monster. Gathering her strength to control her legs, which felt like putty, she stumbled over to the stone cottage as fast as she could. On the way there, she tripped and fell quite a few times in her haste, bruising and wounding herself. This, however, did not deter her from her goal as she gritted her teeth and braved on. Finally, she reached the stone cottage and knocked on the wooden door with all her might. Fortunately, the door opened as it always did, revealing Shiwei's not so handsome but pleasant looking face. Before he could greet her, the girl shouted, "Mr. Shiwei, please help save everyone." What happened? Shiwei asked, perplexed by how ragged the girl looked. As a deity, Shi Wei had the ability divine eye, and could observe and look places and people that were not under the influence of another deity. But since he was still weak at this point, he could only see some vague images like a faulty surveillance camera. Adding on to that was the fact that using this ability required him to consume his divine energy. Therefore, he only used it once or twice on Alina with the thoughts of wanting to understand her to convince her to join his church, and no, it's not because he's a pervert, before giving up on this ability entirely. Alina quickly explained what had happened to the village. "Please save us." Alina pleaded as she cried, "If you can rescue our village, I'll do anything, even be the saintess." "Faith is not something that can be exchanged so easily," he said calmly. But Alina was at a loss. Other than herself, she didn't have anything else that she could have used to exchange for his help. "It's okay, let me go take a look, all right." Honestly, Shi Wei did not have any thoughts of wanting anything in return. He had just transmigrated as a deity after all, and he still had the mentality of a human being and wanted to help the villagers out. But now my time in the mortal realm is going to become even lower, he thought resignedly. Chapter 5. Saintess in Training. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. When Alina brought Shi Wei back to Kennington, there weren't many villagers remaining. Even the ones who had been able to survive had been only able to do that due to the fact that the Dragon Fang had been using them to satisfy its beastly nature to hunt and toy with its prey. It would repeatedly let the villagers it captured flee, then chase after them and capture them back to where they started, then let them go again, and repeating the process all over again. The moment the villagers got mauled until they couldn't move or until it got bored of them, it would finish them in one bite. Suddenly, the Dragon Fang lifted its head and fixed its gaze on the entrance of the village. It smelled the scent of new prey, but also sensed the danger that came along with it. "Mr. Shi Wei." Alina gripped onto his shirt as she spoke, her voice trembling with fear. "Don't worry, it'll be fine," Shi Wei reassured, patting her head gently. At first, the sight of the grotesque monster startled Shi Wei, as there were no animals that looked as fierce as the one before it did. Immediately after, he realized that the Dragon Fang did not have any magical energy. Even though it seemed like it held some degree of intelligence, at its core it could not even be counted as a magical beast. If it were enemies of this level, Shi Wei could defeat dozens of them without batting an eyelid. The Dragon Fang probably knew that it was being looked down upon by its prey, so it growled in anger and pounced in their direction. Feeling a sharp gust of wind coming in his direction, Shi Wei huffed coldly and stared at the monster head on. Without him moving even a finger, the monster was deflected by an unseen force. Most of the bone plates on the monster's body shattered, and even the spikes on its tail broke. Like a mutt that had its legs broken, the Dragon Fang stumbled and let out a wail in pain. The scene that unfolded in front of her stunned Alina to her core. She could not believe her eyes. Even though she somewhat felt that this man was strong and had the ability to defeat the Dragon Fang, she did not think that he was powerful enough to defeat it without even lifting a finger. Actually, it wasn't hard to understand why the Dragon Fang ended up like this. If you spit toward the sky, it would ultimately land on your own face. Even though Shi Wei was one of the weakest deities in the pantheon, he was still a god. The moment the Dragon Fang attacked him, it triggered Shi Wei's divine fury, immediately causing its attack to be countered onto itself twofold. Deities were not invincible, but if anyone wanted to challenge a deity, they would have to at least be a legendary warrior that was not confined by natural laws. If they did not meet that prerequisite, no number of mortals would be a match for a deity. "Mr. Shi Wei, it's going to run away." Alina shouted worriedly as she saw the Dragon Fang limping away from the village, pulling on Shi Wei's shirt. Growing up in the mountains, she knew that many wild beasts were very vengeful creatures, and if they failed to slay it, the Dragon Fang would definitely come back to seek revenge. "Alina, I can only do this much," he explained, shaking his head before looking at her seriously. "Do you want to avenge your family with your own hands?" Elena's eyes brightened, before dimming again and shaking her head. I can't defeat it, I'm too weak. Even if the dragon Fang were at the end of its rope, a young girl like Elena still wouldn't be able to defeat it. Shi Wei nodded in agreement. Had Elena been too terrified to avenge the villagers, or had she been blinded by hatred and rushed in without any thought, he might have been truly disappointed in her. Even though she met with such a terrible fate, she could still think and weigh her options calmly without letting it get to her head. It was a valuable trait to have for a young girl who grew up in a remote village such as this. What if the god of games could give you the power to defeat your enemies? Shi Wei coaxed patiently. Elena remained silent for a while, before resolutely lifting her head and fixing her gaze on Shi Wei. Then I am willing to become a believer of the god of games. Belief isn't something to only be spoken by mouth. Close your eyes and envision his name in your mind, and feel his power with your heart, he said solemnly. If he had said the same words to a person on earth, they would probably think that he was mentally unstable, but in this world it gave off a feeling that he really knew what he was talking about. Elena followed his instructions and closed her eyes, uttering the name of the god of games internally. When she was at her most desperate, the deities that she had worshipped had not even offered even a bit of pity and help. It was Shi Wei that had given her salvation and reignited the sparks of hope in her heart. So at that moment, Elena truly offered her most sincere and earnest prayer. Speak the words, O Master of Games, grant us new life, in your mind, his voice rang out in the silence. O Master of Games, grant us new life, Elena muttered faithfully, as if she was sending up a prayer to the heavens. The very next moment, Shi Wei could sense pure and abundant amounts of divine energy rising from Elena. B'Noel Dem, this is it. Shi Wei thought excitedly. He immediately followed up with the steps he envisioned countless times in his mind, projecting the system which he had consumed divine energy to create into the young girl through the path of faith that had been opened between them due to her belief in him. It all comes down to this. Regardless of what was happening over at Shi Wei's side, Elena, who had been closing her eyes, saw a strange page appear in front of her in the darkness. Player. Elena, class. Saintess in, training, level. 1, EXP 0/100, HP 50/50ths, MP 30/30ths, stats. 1 STR, 1 AGI, 2 INT, 1, skill points. 1. Elena opened her eyes in shock to realize that the page had not disappeared, it didn't seem to be an illusion. What is this? Elena muttered perplexedly under her breath. This is a gift from the god of games to those who believe in him. As long as you believe in him, it will not disappear, he explained, smiling softly. Now, quickly add a skill point to one of your skills, and slay that dragon Fang yourself. Elena stared at Shi Wei for a while, the cogs in her mind turning for a while before she came to, and nodded enthusiastically before asking shyly, stuttering a little, How do I add a skill point, and what is a skill? Skills are the sacred arts that the god of games has blessed you with, he explained patiently, not knowing whether he should laugh at how the girl got stuck at this point. Open the skill tree page, and use the skill point you have to activate it. The dimmed out ones mean that you're not of a high enough level or ability to learn it. How amazing! Elena started controlling the unfamiliar system clumsily, muttering in amazement. As a child who had been born and raised in the village, Elena had learned Shimonian 1 from her father before, but only knew a few words. Even so, she could still understand all the words that were written on the system page. This was due to the fact that Shi Wei used godly script to create these pages, and the language could be understood by everyone regardless of race or whether they were illiterate. Seeing the dragon Fang almost escape from the village, Elena quickly chose to learn an attack skill which could be learned by a holy maiden at level 1, Spear of Victory. Gathering holy divine energy into a golden spear, she shot it toward the dragon Fang, pinning the vile beast to the ground. The heavily wounded monster spasmed and struggled for a while, before it breathed its last breath and died. Elena could finally breathe a sigh of relief. To her surprise, the corpse of the dragon Fong started emitting a soft golden glow before disappearing completely, leaving behind some shattered bone plates, some sharp teeth, and claws. What happened to the monster? Elena asked in her astonishment. Enemies killed by using the sacred arts would be offered to the god of games as a sacrifice, but sometimes enemies would leave behind some materials, as well as rewards, aka loot, from him. The rewards you're given would depend on the strength of the enemy you defeated, he explained. After that, the god of games would give you experience points based on the enemies you've sacrificed. When your experience points bar is filled up, you would be able to level up and learn new skills, and then become even stronger. In essence, experience points were derived from divine energy. Upon receiving sacrifices from his believers, he would be able to split the divine energy obtained into two. 70% would be kept in his divine kingdom, while 30% would be given to the believer who did the sacrifice through their path of faith in the form of divine grace. As the energy continues to accumulate, the divine energy would be converted into a form of energy that could be used by humans, or in other words, leveling up. As soon as he spoke, a golden glow rose from the young girl, a sign that she had leveled up after she defeated the Dragon Fong. Chapter 6. O Master of Games, grant us new life. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. Mr. Shiwei, I saw a skill called Raise Dead. Does that mean? Elena, who had just leveled up, looked at Shiwei hopefully. Shiwei knew that she wanted to bring back the villagers who had passed away. Unfortunately, it cannot be done, he said, breaking her fantasy without remorse. Raise Dead can only be used to revive believers of the god of games, consuming their experience points too. As cruel as it may sound, these are rules set between the deities, we can't interfere. Actually, even this sort of half-baked revival was made possible by taking advantage of some loopholes left by Lord Hades. Originally, the god of games did not have divine order to interfere with death, but for Shiwei it was common knowledge for in-game characters to be able to revive after death. Thus, he decided to create a revival mechanism for his believers, and he had succeeded. If his believers still believed in him at their time of death, they would be able to trigger the revival mechanism and have their souls sent for safekeeping in Shiwei's divine kingdom. This state was not truly a state of death, so Lord Hades, who had power over the netherworld and death, would not be aware that a supposedly dead soul was intercepted. If someone cast a revival spell on a believer in this state, as in their corpse, they would be able to revive the believer while expending 10% of the experience points of the one who was revived. If no one helped them to revive, they would still directly be revived after 70.2 hours, expending 30% of their experience points. Once their experience points weren't enough to revive, they would drop a level, so in a way of speaking, a level 1 believer who did not have more than 10% of experience points would truly be beyond saving, while as long as they had more than 20% of experience points, they would never really die. Excluding Lord Hades, even if the other deities tried this, it wouldn't have worked, as even though it was stepping a thin line, they would definitely need a divine order associated with death to be able to carry it out. As the deity that had power over death itself, the faith of a living being meant nothing to Lord Hades. He wouldn't go out of his way to revive his followers like this. Had he done so, it would have greatly reduced the fear that all living beings had in death, and in the process bringing down his prestige. He wouldn't do something like that unless he was still well in the head. In turn, the revival mechanism let Shiwei understand even further that as long as it involved things that he considered to be common sense for games, he would now be able to influence it to a certain extent. Comparing himself with the previous god of games, he was definitely better. Rounded. The girl who had just gotten hopeful started sniffling as her hopes were dashed with a bucket of cold water. Even so, she did not escape the reality of what had happened, and instead added the skill point she had just obtained onto a healing skill, Healing Touch, quickly making her way over to the survivors who were hanging on by a breath. As she stretched out her hand, her palm started to emit a holy and pure glow. Had someone else been here to witness this scene, They would have even believed if someone told them she was an experienced nun, had it not been for how green +1 numbers were floating from the heads of the people lying on the floor. These villagers were not even hurt all that badly. They just had their strengths depleted being used as toys by the Dragon Fang. In the first place, those who were chosen to be its toys were all young villagers with more stamina. Therefore, the +1s didn't appear for much longer before they were completely healed. These villagers had already been on the brink of despair after their multiple failed attempts to escape, but in a sudden turn of events, the Dragon Tooth had been slain in moments. Even though the one who landed the final hit on the monster was Alina, the villagers knew that the one who had truly saved them from the disaster was the mysterious outsider. Honorable One. The villagers who survived were all young people around 12 to 15 years old, consisting of 3 boys and a girl. One of the youngsters who looked like their leader stepped shakily toward Shi Wei and kneeled down, with gut-wrenching sobs tearing from his chest as he pleaded, "Our village has been completely destroyed, and there would be no use staying here. If we don't starve to death we would be devoured by vicious beasts. Please save us." Shi Wei rubbed his chin in thought. It seemed that they had mistaken him for a wandering magician, and wanted him to take them in. But seeing as he didn't have a lot of time left in the mortal realm, he gave up on the idea of getting attendance. "I'm sorry but I cannot take you in, but if you are willing to believe in the great god of games, I would be able to direct a path for you," he said solemnly. The youngster was a little disappointed by his refusal, but still bowed down toward him earnestly, "We are willing to worship the god of games." The other survivors followed his example and bowed down, but since they hadn't been educated on this sort of etiquette, they looked like large frogs lying on the ground. Under Alina's hopeful gaze, Shi Wei waited for a moment before furrowing his brow. He could not even feel a speck of divine energy coming from these boys and girls. Evidently they were just saying it, and not believing in the god of games from the bottom of their hearts like Alina did. Shi Wei wanted to tear apart their facade, but held himself back. Back on Earth, he was an atheist, so he could more or less understand how the youngsters were feeling now. No one would open their hearts and believe in a religion that they had never heard of before with just a few words. Even marketing promoters could not do that so easily. After all, even Alina who he was most familiar with refused him back when he first requested her to become his saintess, not to mention these youngsters which he had never even seen before. And so after thinking for a while, he said, "I know that all of you have just lost all of your loved ones and helplessly looked on as they were killed mercilessly at the beast's maw. Escaping death by only a fraction, you all are in extreme pain and anguish. But even now in your bleakest moment, have the deities that you have believed in so earnestly even given you even a morsel of aid and pity? Even if you went to the churches in the city, and confided all your grief towards those priests with bloated bellies, they would only respond with perfunctory words like, 'This was as the gods fated it to be,' without even the slightest bit of pity." The young boy's expressions turned distressed and bitter, while the only girl other than Alina started sobbing. Alina came to her side, and gently pat her back comfortingly. "But is that the truth?" "Not at all. Your existence means nothing to those high and mighty deities. Why would they care for you? You were deserted by them, like how humans would never care for ants that have been eaten by an anteater. These deities have never batted an eye at your suffering. Having heard all this, why do you still beg for them to feed you morsels like pitiful strays?" Shi Wei continued in a provocative tone, getting louder and louder. "Rather than waiting for divine grace which those deities would never bless you with, why not use your own 2 hands to forge a path for yourself? There is no true fairness in this world, but fairness is exactly the gift that he gives to all of his believers. Why not give it a try? Use your own hands and hard work to defy your so-called fate." As an ending to his invigorating speech, he smiled softly and said, "O Master of Games, grant us new life." Chapter 7. The Doctrines. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. True to Shi Wei's assumptions, the young brats who had lacked experience were easily swayed by his words. The moment he uttered the words, "O Master of Games, grant us new life," the youngsters unconsciously repeated those words under their breath. The very next moment, Shi Wei felt a rush of divine energy rising to the heavens. Even though their beliefs were not as strong as a devout believer like Elena, they already passed the threshold of shallow belief, already becoming true believers and satisfying the conditions to activate their systems. Am I seeing things? Something appeared in front of me. Me too. What is this? The brats collectively gasped in astonishment as the system page appeared in front of them. Don't be afraid, this is a gift from the god of games. Shi Wei said, his voice calming them down. Different from the Saintess system he specially crafted for Elena, the systems they activated were just basic footman systems 1. They did not even have classes. If they were transmigrators from Earth, they would have probably guessed what to do after seeing this system page, all the basics of doing quests and killing mobs to level up, and getting to the top of the pyramid and maybe even open a harem. But as this was all new to the people of this world, especially to these youngsters who had not even experienced the wide world, they would have to spend lots of time to understand and utilize the system properly. Hence, Shi Wei explained to them in detail how to use the system. Levels are a measure of strength. Everyone starts out as level 1, and the higher this number gets the more powerful you get. When you level up, you will be rewarded skill points. Oh, also, the level cap now is level 30 before the system is updated. You can only level up by accumulating experience points which you can obtain by defeating monsters. Yes, it's the thing at the bottom. Why are they called experience points? Have you never heard of the saying, practice makes perfect? What, you haven't? Your class is the direction you would develop in the future. There are 4 classes you can choose from. Warrior, Ranger, Mage, and Cleric. The differences between the 4 are mainly their abilities and their stat growth. What? No, you don't need to worship the Azure Sorcerer to become a mage. Why isn't there a Hunter class? Well, it's almost the same as a Ranger. Skills are the sacred arts that the god of games has blessed you with, and they need to be learned slowly by leveling up. Some abilities even have stat requirements. Casting most of these skills would require you to use your MP. Yes, it's the blue bar. Stats are a reflection of your specs. What are specs? They're your physical and mental abilities. If your HP gauge empties out, you will die, and if your MP gauge becomes empty, you wouldn't be able to use skills. Strength determines your physical power, agility determines your speed and reflexes, intelligence determines your willpower and mental ability, stuff like that. Why does he have 2 strength and you only have 1? His arms are almost as thick as your thighs. Your starting stats are all dependent on your personal abilities, don't question it. You have no one to blame but yourself. After all of these technicalities were new and interesting for the youngsters, that they could think of all sorts of questions from different angles, almost giving Shi Wei a headache. But also because of this, they quickly took hold of the situation. As young people who were still growing up, their ability to learn and absorb information was stronger than adults. I choose to be a mage. I've always wanted to learn magic, said the boy who looked like their leader. I want to be a warrior. My father was a blacksmith, so I know where the best swords in the village are. Exclaimed the strong-looking boy who had a beginning strength stat of 2. Can I be a cleric? Asked the only other girl than Elena timidly. Then I'll be a ranger, I'm great at using a slingshot. The last boy decided. And so the 4 youngsters quickly picked their classes. Shi Wei, who had been watching the entire exchange, had wanted to remind them that they could choose the same classes, but seeing how well it went, he decided against it. Right, tell me your names. Seeing the 4 starting to examine their system pages, Shi Wei suddenly remembered to ask their names. I am Edward Kennington, said the young man who decided to be a mage. My name is Jessica Weiss, muttered the girl who chose to be a cleric. You can call me Joe Paul, declared the one who chose to be a warrior. My name is Go Dan 1, said the one who decided to be a ranger. Shi Wei's eye twitched. Why is your name so special? My father was a refugee who didn't have a family name, Go Dan confessed truthfully. Then from today on your name is Doug A.G., Shi Wei decided. For what it was worth, these people were the first believers he had developed that might become his disciples in the future. If this boy kept the name Go Dan, his church might not even feel prestigious anymore. Go Dan or Doug stared at Shi Wei for a moment before enthusiastically nodding his head. Snapping his fingers, he created white words that floated on the top of their heads, with their name written. This sign can only be seen by players who are believers of the God of Games. If you see anyone else who has these words floating on their heads, they're your fellow believers. Shi Wei advised them, even though our church does not ask for all of you to love each other, but you can't trip each other up on purpose, all right? Hearing so, the 5 youngsters nodded and memorized that their believers were called players. Elena was most familiar with Shi Wei, hence the one who was the least timid to speak with him stepped forward and asked, Mr. Shi Wei, what are the doctrines of our church? Shi Wei spaced out momentarily as he had not thought of this, but then started speaking without thinking too much. First, life is just a game. The moment you started believing in the God of Games, you became a player. Second, time is money, my friend. Money can buy everything except your experience points, so you can't buy happiness with your salary one. Third, even if you hold the responsibility of saving the world on your shoulders, why not take a breather and play some cards? Fourth, everything that has a health point gauge can become experience points, so remember that slaying monsters are just a means, slaughter is not your goal. Fifth, strength completely depends on the current version. Never blame yourself for the path you have chosen. If you want to blame someone, then blame the cursed game designers. Sixth, never throw away your honor as a player, or you will be punished by the God of Games. Seventh, before you take an arrow to the knee, enjoy it with all your heart. 18. The God of Games reserves the right to final interpretation of the doctrines herein above. Chapter 8. Guidance. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The 5 youngsters did not have any particular reaction to the doctrines he had set, given that they couldn't understand the references to games from his past life, neither could they understand the deeper meaning held in his doctrines. Shi Wei didn't rush to the next step in his plan, but instead lead the youngsters to bury the villagers' dead bodies. From a certain aspect, dragon fangs had the same instincts and mannerisms as felines. They hunted not only because they want to fill their bellies, but also because they enjoyed the feeling of the hunt. Therefore, the villagers who had been eaten by the dragon fang were just a minority. A majority of them were just killed for no reason. If they left the dead bodies here, the rotting flesh would probably attract the attention of carnivorous beasts nearby to feast on the corpses. In fact, Shi Wei could see a few raven-like birds circling the air above, ready to swoop for food at a moment's notice. Putting aside Shi Wei, who had been educated as a Chinese to respect the dead and to give them proper burials, and even just thinking from the perspective of the surviving youngsters, leaving the corpses out to the brazen wilderness was not a nice feeling. With Shi Wei around, the steps which would have consumed the most time, the digging and burial of the corpses, did not take much time to do at all. Before the sun set, they finished a simple burial ritual. A wooden cross stood at the center of what was the center of the village, and now their grave. They had not really realized it when they were occupied by the strange systems which were gifted to them, but as their families and loved ones who seemed like they were asleep were covered by dirt and completely buried, the reality finally hit them. They would never be able to see their family ever again. Elena and Jessica both broke down into tears, while Joe and Go Dan were sobbing quietly at the side. Even though Edward seemed to be in extreme sorrow too, he somehow held it together and did not shed a single tear. Mr. Shi Wei, what should we do now? Elena asked tentatively, having only just stopped her tears. There would be no meaning in staying here anymore. At daybreak, travel east, through Eurasia and towards the county called Jonias at the boundary of the empire. There, outside the Amaranthan Gate known as the Valley of the Tragic Dead is a small town, Shi Wei instructed after seeing all their gazes on him, that will be your destination and the home base from which our church will grow, our starter village. But we've never been so far from Kennington before. Elena said as she held her hands to her chest, her expression similar to a pigeon that was going on its first flight. There will always be a first time for everything, child. Go forth with pride, for you are blessed by the great god of games, Shi Wei said comfortingly, petting her head. But she was still unsure. It was at this point that she realized that the gentle hand that had been petting her head disappeared. Mr. Shi Wei. Elena looked around, but she could not find him anymore. The other youngsters shook their heads as though they had just woken up from a dream. Where did the Great One go? Joe asked in confusion, furrowing his brow. I have no idea. Didn't you guys see? Go Dan scratched his head. I blanked out for a second and he was gone. Jessica said in frustration. If I remember correctly. Edward, who was the eldest, spoke suddenly. And so their gazes all fell on him, wanting to hear what he had to say. My father and I heard this when we went to the city, but even the great archbishop did not have the qualification to appoint a saintess, he explained slowly. Was Uncle Shi Wei a pope? Go Dan asked in shock. No, a pope would not wander too far from their church unless it's absolutely necessary, Edward refuted, shaking his head. If I had a say in it, there would be a higher probability that he was a chosen one. But I don't feel that he was a chosen one. What are you trying to say, Edward? Joe, who was not a quick thinker, asked impatiently. Jessica seemed to have thought of something, her eyes widening in shock. Do you mean? Yes, I believe that Shi Wei might have been the incarnation of deities like legends say. Edward revealed his guess, not wanting to keep up the suspense. That's not possible. Joe shook his head in disbelief. I think so too. Jessica said in agreement. Putting aside Elena who had the qualifications to become a saintess, the four of us are just ordinary villagers. Under normal circumstances, we would never be noticed by a deity, let alone be blessed with such a precious gift. If he wasn't a deity, what merits do the four of us have for him to request systems for us? Edward exclaimed passionately, fire burning in his eyes. Just think of it. Leaving behind guidance for us before disappearing the next moment, isn't that exactly how deities send down oracles? Having heard Edward's deductions, the others were more or less convinced. So, I was named by a deity. Go Dan gasped, trembling with excitement. You guys can't call me Go Dan anymore, call me Doug. Alright Go Dan, roger that Go Dan, no problem Go Dan, the other three immediately answered, while Elena smiled wryly at the side. Go Dan was speechless. In conclusion, I believe our path is clear. Edward coughed softly and continued seriously, everyone, prepare and rest well. We'll head east at dawn. The other four had no objections and quickly returned to their own homes, preparing themselves to leave the village they had grown up in. Shi Wei, who had returned to his divine kingdom, was looking in using his divine eye, and he was pleasantly surprised. He completely didn't expect Edward to be able to deduce his actual identity. Even though the deduction process was a mess, he somehow managed to come to the correct answer. Seeing the five youngsters get back on their feet, he smiled in relief, even though he didn't have a face in this form. As expected, choosing young people as his first believers was a good choice. Not only do they accept things better, they also could learn about new things easier. They would be able to get back on their feet more easily than people who were older than them. If that's so, then I can't lag behind. I must complete all preparations before they arrive at the town. His worries of dissipating were now gone with the wind due to his 4 true believers and 1 devout believer. He could use more divine energy to prepare for their arrival. Chapter 9. The Valley of the Tragic Dead. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. The town outside of the Valley of the Tragic Dead was not a place that he had chosen on a whim, but a place he had chosen after meticulous planning. Kennington Village was too remote, and the surrounding forests only held regular beasts. It would not be a good place for players to grind and earn levels. Due to the fact that other deities existed, there were a lot of churches or temples built in their honor all over the prime material plane, releasing divine energy like a protective barrier. If Shi Wei did not have any believers around those places, he would not be able to observe those places using his divine eye alone. On the other side of the spectrum, places that were not covered by divine energy were impoverished and unsuitable to become a starter village for his believers. But in the end, Shi Wei found a few passable areas after spending some time. The Valley of the Tragic Dead was exactly one of those places. In a world filled with deities, the cliché-sounding war of gods and demons had naturally happened before. Shi Wei did not know the details as the god of games had not been created at the time, but from the vague marks left behind by natural laws on his divine records, it seemed that a lot of realms had been involved with this terrible war. It was that war that had almost reset the entire world and had caused the three saints of creation to completely separate the divine realm from all the other realms and made them forbid deities from heading to other realms. As the bridge which connected the east and west continents, the Valley of the Tragic Dead, which spanned up to 100 kilometers, was one of the war zones of the war. It was here that Lord Hades had slain the primordial god of death, and stole his power over the netherworld and death itself. When the primordial god of death ceased to be, it let out copious amounts of deadly miasma, killing almost half of the living beings on the prime material plane. 1,000 years later, the grey miasma still filled the Valley of the Tragic Dead, turning the valley into a forbidden land for all living beings, and cutting all contact between continents entirely. Shi Wei was not overconfident enough to have the players challenge the remains of the primordial god so quickly, but a rift in space caused by the miasma was formed. From this place came millions of revenants that immediately flooded the valley, even the parts that were not covered by miasma. The number of revenants increased by the dozens each year, and their natural hate toward everything that lived and breathed made them leave the valley in hordes, sieging any human settlement they came across. Every year, the Empire spent innumerable amounts of money to wipe out these revenants. Not that the Empire didn't want to solve the root of the problem. There were no mainstream deities that held influence over death, and so they could do nothing. L.C. Even if they expended large amounts of divine energy to create protective talismans for their believers, they could only protect one or two of them from perishing in the miasma. This amount was pitifully low when compared to the revenants that filled every nook and cranny of the valley. Lord Hades was an extremely introverted deity and always kept to himself, not interacting with any other deities and by extension, not helping to deal with this problem. Ultimately, the Valley of the Tragic Dead could only stay the way it was on this continent. The priests of the brilliant White Church had predicted that the miasma would dissipate on its own in 3,000 to 4,000 years. And that was if they were lucky. This land, which was seen as poisonous and deadly by the other deities, became the ideal place for Shi Wei to set up his starter village, unlimited number of monsters, imperishable resources, and he did not have to worry about affecting the ecology of this world by slaying beasts. In addition, the revenants here grew stronger, from skeletons and zombies to the Dullahans and zombie dragons deep within the miasma, basically a complete chain of monsters that continued getting stronger. He did not have to worry about the players not being able to meet their match. Other than that, even though it was a shot in the dark, but since the valley was a key war zone in the war, perhaps there would be some precious loot in there as well. Like sacred weapons or divinity fragments, for example. Even if that was not the case and there weren't any other treasures in there, there would still definitely be the remains of a primordial deity. If the players could get their hands on it and sacrifice it to him, he could definitely increase his divinity by another level. But before I get ahead of myself, I must make some preparations first, he grumbled to himself. If those children traveled all the way here and had to come face to face with violence, then I'd lose all my dignity as their deity. Angora Faust was the third son of the Silver Eagle Duke, Horan Faust. As the youngest child in his family, he definitely had no hope of succeeding the dukeship. That being said, the elderly duke had no plans on letting his child with noble blood become a lowly peasant. However, Angora had no talent in martial arts, and so he could not be a knight and seize glory for himself on the battlefield. Even though he worshipped the god of war Kratos along with his father, he was only a shallow believer who could not even use battle chi no matter how hard he tried, and so he could not become a priest in the Temple of Glory either. As he became, his older brother who had always disliked him awakened the power of battle chi without even trying hard and beat him up, stepping all over his pride. That was the last straw for him to completely lose faith in Kratos, becoming a non-believer without anyone knowing. Thankfully, the Duke wasn't a heartless man. After concluding that Angora did not have any other talents, he specially used his connections to give Angora a position as a baron, along with his own piece of land. Even if it was a small town outside of Amaranthan Gate that was feared by everyone, he would still be a nobleman. Quoting the Duke's words, being a nobleman in a somewhat dangerous place was leagues better than being a lowly peasant. In the carriage that was bumping and shaking on the road, Angora felt that his future was bleak. According to reports, every year the revenants would attack any human settlements near to the Valley of the Tragic Dead, and under those situations, he wouldn't think that he was any safer than the average commoner. While he was still worrying about his future, the elderly chauffeur suddenly yelled, "Bandits! There are bandits here! Young master, please! Arg!" The voice of the chauffeur who had always been loyal to a fault disappeared after a harrowing yell. Angora was shaking in fear. Was he going to die before he reached his goal? God! If you truly exist, please give me some hope, he pleaded in his despair at this moment. Ding! You have activated the Overlord system. Chapter 10. Hitman Genie. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Translator. Endless Fantasy Translation Editor. Endless Fantasy Translation. What the heck? As Angora blanked out from surprise, a semi-transparent screen appeared in front of him, with the words, "O Master of Games, grant us new life," written on it. Before Angora could question what it was, the words on the screen vanished. Along with a cool startup screen with polygons and light effects, the main user interface of the system appeared. Player. Angora Faust, Class. Unknown Lord, Prosperity. 0 out of 100, Achievement Points. 100, Starting Value, Population. 0/0, Players. 0, Buildings. None, Storage, LV0. Hitman Genie, Grade A, X1, Empty, Empty, Previous page. Next page. Angora looked quickly through the words written on the screen, finally laying his eyes on the item called the Hitman Genie. As he focused on it, a corresponding pop-up screen appeared next to it. Item. Hitman Genie Lamp, Grade A, Description. Consumable item. Rubbing the lamp will summon a Grade A genie to fight for you. Time of effect. 1 minute. Disclaimer. Do not treat the genie as your slave, and do not wish for anything. It would only beat up your enemies and nothing else. Et. Receive. Yes/no, what is this? Angora felt like he was experiencing the weirdest situation he had even gone through in his whole life. Without giving him more time to think, the entrance to the carriage was destroyed forcefully by the bandits, breaking into splinters of wood. A strong-looking man with a tattoo on his bald head came in and grabbed Angora's leg, smiling viciously as he dragged him out of the carriage. Angora could taste metal as he fell unceremoniously onto the hard ground, every bone and joint in his body aching. He did not have time to waste. Focusing on the Hitman Genie lamp, he chose to receive it. The next moment, a bronze lamp that looked like a teapot dropped into his hands. What? Hey, did you guys see that? Why is there something in his hand? Is he casting sacred arts? The bandits hesitated due to the lamp that suddenly appeared. Don't be afraid. Even if he is a priest, no one would know that we did it if he dies here. The bald bandit shouted as he swung his long sword towards Angora's head. At the same time, Angora started rubbing the lamp fervently like he had gone crazy. As the sword was about to hit him, a blue mist started gushing out from the lamp. The mist expanded like it had a physical body, blocking the sword from hitting Angora. The next moment, the blue mist converged in mid-air and formed a large blue dot-skinned humanoid form. The genie of the lamp is at your service. Now, who do you want me to deal with? Asked the large blue face that looked like Will Smith, smiling weirdly as he raised his brow and stretched out his arms. An axe that was even bigger than his body appeared in thin air along with some sparkly effects. My axe is thirsting for blood. Not only was Angora stunned, the bandits were also scared stiff by the genie that suddenly appeared. The one who reacted the fastest was the bald bandit. Don't be scared. It's probably just big and not strong at all. The other bandits were encouraged as they all lifted their weapons and surrounded the genie. Some of them who thought they were smart pointed their weapons at Angora, thinking that if Angora was killed, the genie would disappear. Save me. Kill them. Angora shouted hurriedly. As you wish, the genie hummed in glee. The next moment, he quickly swung his axe in a circle, cleaving all the bandits into two along with their weapons except for one who had immediately done a backflip to evade the attack. Even as they died, the bandits could not understand why they were killed in an instant on a run. The mill robbery by someone they thought was a pushover. The bald bandit who seemed like their leader regretted their choice to rob them dearly. *CK, didn't that guy say that the youngest son of the Faust family was a pushover? How could he summon this monstrosity? He realized that he was totally out of the genie's league, and so he turned around and tried to flee for his life. The genie only waved the axe in the air in response, the weapon growing larger and larger. With another swing, he sent the 40-meter axe in the direction of the fleeing bandit. Wait, spare him. Angora suddenly shouted. Hearing the command, the genie slightly angled the axe to a side, gouging a 5-meter deep incision on the ground. The bandit was not harmed, but the explosive power that almost hit him shook him to his core, his legs softening into putty as he fell to the ground. How do you want me to deal with him? The genie asked as he pulled the bandit over to Angora. Decapitation. Mutilation. I'm very good at torturing people, you see. As he said so, the axe in his hands disappeared, and replacing it was a fishnet and a slicing knife. I know that I did wrong, Master Faust. Please spare me. The bandit who had seemed quite manly was scared to tears by the genie as he kneeled down and hit his forehead to the ground. I have a question for you, and if you answer me honestly I might not kill you. Angora declared as he stared him in the eye. Why would you know that the pushover youngest son of the Faust family would come by here? Who is that guy? I don't know, the bandit stuttered. Finish him. Roger that. Wait, I really don't know. My client has always been very mysterious, but I can tell you that he is from the Society of the Secret Eye. Society of the Secret Eye? Angora asked curiously, having never heard the name before. It is a group that smuggles things through the mountain range around the Amaranthan Gate by using cloud falcons. They smuggle precious treasures from the western continent, the bandit confessed, wanting to stay alive. It holds overwhelming power in this area and has lots of outer ring organizations. The 13 Caves of the Minotaur are one of them.